Welcome to the third installment of the Teaching in Tea and Coffee series. This particular topic is All Students Are Motivated, Just Wait for the Bell. And lesson 3 is called Salesman of the Year. So I bet you didn't know that as a teacher, you are going to have to be a salesperson. You're going to have to sell the lesson. And so this comes directly from a theory called Self-Determination Theory. And there are 3 principles I want to point out to you. The first one is that people proactively seek to influence themselves and their environment. What this means is that people aren't just going to let life pass them by, even though at times we may think that our students are just sitting there like blobs. But that's not true, because what self-determination theory states is that kids and adults, everybody, proactively wants to influence their environment. Now, even if that means influencing their environment by sitting there comfortably and looking out the window. It could be influencing their environment by making jokes, or throwing something across the room, or poking a neighbor, or doing their work. The second principle of self-determination theory is that people are self-organizing and tend toward growth. Now, this is fascinating to me, because it tells me that people innately want to grow. They don't want to stagnate and sit and do nothing. They want to grow. This is, again, vital to what we're learning about motivation. Remember, the last lesson was all about motivation is, by its very nature, something we want to do. That's the essence of it. And here we have a theory where principle 2 is telling us that that's exactly right. And then the third principle is this. Optimal development is not automatic. As much as I wish I could be like the movie The Matrix, plug it into the back of my head, and all of a sudden I would know how to do karate. But that doesn't happen that way. We actually have to work to realize our potential. What I'd like you to do right now is to write down the key terms within each of these 3 principles. So for each principle, write down a key term. Now, a second aspect of self-determination theory is all about needs. Every human being has these 3 innate needs that we must satisfy. Now, I want you to see if you can make the connection between these 3 and Glasser's needs from the previous lesson. So the first one here is autonomy. This is our desire to be causal in our lives. We want to be agents of destiny. We want a sense of choice when acting. We want to experience volition. So for our students, they want to have a sense of, I can do this, in the sense of you're allowing me to do it. Now, do you know which of Glasser's needs this one is most like? You're exactly correct. It's freedom. Now, the second here is competence. Competence is that sense of, I can, I'm able, I can do this. It's the desire to be effective in dealing with my environment. I want to have an effect on my environment and those around me. It's a way to attempt to master the world around us, and that sense of effectiveness in what we're doing. And so which one of Glasser's needs, this was a little bit trickier, most connects to this? If you said recognition, you are correct. It's that sense of being recognized for being able and being somebody who can make effect on things. Now, the last need, according to self-determination theory, is relatedness. Relatedness. This is the propensity to interact with and be connected to other people who care about ourselves and the things that we care about. What of Glasser's needs does this connect to? Now, if you said belonging, you are absolutely correct. That is what it connects to. Now, relatedness is the sense of identification with others. People want to be identified with other people and with groups. I would like you to highlight the key terms in these needs. Now, when we're talking about motivation, Competence and autonomy are the energizing basis for intrinsically motivated behavior. Now, so we have to define what is motivation. The individual forces that account for the direction, energy, your notes say level, so make that change, energy and persistence of a person's effort expended. So when we have we can decide motivationally whether we're going to do A or B. So all of my examples right now are going to be completely binary. Now, we know that motivation is on a continuum and there's a lot of factors. But right now, just for example's sake, we're going to make these binary. So when we talk about direction, energy, and persistence, this is what they mean. Direction is the individual's choice when presented with a number of different options. All right, so now let's make an example here. You have just given an activity for your class. Your student can either choose, again, we're making this binary for simplification, choose to directionally do the task or not do the task. So they would rather not do the task and look out the window or play with his or her friend or play with the pencil or whatever. Or they're going to engage in the task. Now, once let's say they've engaged in the task. Now, once they've engaged in that task, it's the amount of energy or effort that they're actually going to put into it. So again, let's make it binary. So the student has chosen to do the task. So now he or she can either do that task with lots of energy and like, I'm going to go ahead and show initiative and I'm going to put all my into it. Or I'm going to put a little bit, if none at all. So I'm doing it, but I'm going to put very little effort into it. So let's say that the student has chosen to directionally do the assignment, do the task, and put all of his or her effort into it. And then the third aspect of motivation is persistence. And that is the length of time that a person gives in that task. So you can think about this as when you come up against an obstacle, do you get stuck and say, forget it. I'm not going to persist. Forget it. I'm done. I give up. I surrender. Or are you going to come up against that obstacle, that critical thinking, that problem, and overcome? That's persistence. So now let's say we have a student who has directionally decided, I'm going to go ahead and engage in the task. And energy-wise has said, you know what, I'm going to put forth lots of energy. So the third aspect now is persistence. When that student comes across a problem in that activity, such as, I don't know the answer. I don't know where to find that answer. What do I do next? Does that student persist and continue on with that task, or does he or she give up? So that's persistence. So you can see when we're talking about motivation, there's a lot more factors than simply the kid wants to do it or the kid doesn't want to do it. It's one of the reasons why I don't like the term unmotivated kid. You know, he's an unmotivated student. That is not true. So I had somebody ask me about a student who does the task but works at an incredibly slow pace. Well, that to me said that that's really an energy issue. So we need to go in there and attack energy and effort and how much effort they're going to put into it. Okay? So we'll get that a different lesson. But right now, remember the title of this particular lesson is Salesman of the Year. So you are selling the lesson. Alan Mendler says, to inspire motivation among our misguided, motivated students, we must try to sell them on the idea that working at school and achieving is a good thing. You're selling the lesson. Okay, so now we're going to get into something called a text rendering protocol. And in this, you have a text that you're all going to read. You are going to then read and find three different things. You're going to highlight or mark a sentence that is particularly meaningful to you and to the work at hand. In this case, the article is about behavior and categories of behavior. So you're going to find a sentence that really means something to you and is really important to our work in regards to motivation. Secondly, you're going to find a phrase. What's a phrase that is just as important? And then finally is a word. What one word is very important to you in relation to our work in regards to motivation. Now, here are two very powerful ways to address self-determination theory and the needs of every human being, which is competence, autonomy, and relatedness. They're called intake modes and learning styles. Now, how does this connect to self-determination theory and the needs? Is intake modes and learning styles allow students to actively influence their own learning by knowing what way that they better intake information and the way that they better learn or process that information. They'll actively influence their own learning, which goes to the seeking to influence self and also that sense of autonomy. Secondly, with intake modes and learning styles, they have agency. There's capability. I remember one student, after I taught my class about intake modes and learning styles, no lie, one student actually said to me, "Mister, all these years I thought I was just dumb." In other words, he was told over and over again, "Stop playing with that, put that down, don't you ever listen, come on." And he's a tactile learner. And so he needs to touch and to play and to do all these things so that he can listen. But we'll get there. So this attends to the fact that we want to grow and also our sense of wanting to be competent. And then finally, all people can learn. And so this means that we have to work to learn, the third principle, self-determination theory, and it goes along with relatedness. We're all in this together, right? So let's look at them. So when you look at intake modes, it's how information gets into the mind. How does information get into the brain? That's an intake mode. You may see these, auditory, visual, tactile, and kinesthetic, as learning styles. And this is where I differ on that, because it's not how you're learning, it's how you're taking in information. So think of access. Access. How does the student access the information? Is it through auditory? Is it through visual, tactile, or kinesthetic? And let's look at each one of those. So an auditory learner likes to hear things. She wants the information to be spoken or sung, repeated, chanted, maybe put to rhythm. This learner often does very well in school. Why? Because they tend to sit and, you got it, they listen. They generally have very good body language. In other words, their eyes are looking at us, their shoulders are facing toward us. They're typically sitting straight up in their chairs. Why? Because the way that they take in information is through listening, through their ears. So they do all of the necessary listening skills that we generally like to teach, especially in our Western culture. So this student often does very well in our schools. However, most of our students are not auditory. Secondly, we have a visual learner. And by the way, these are all preferences. This is not I'm only an auditory learner. We all generally use all four of these type of intake modes. But we generally lean on or utilize more, prefer one over the others. Next, we have a visual learner. This learner likes to see things, likes pictures and diagrams and graphs and charts. This person pictures in his mind what is being said. So this is why they often take lots of notes, because they're literally seeing what you are talking about. So reading is particularly good for these students. Providing diagrams, again, and charts and graphs, videos are very, very good for a visual learner. Next, we have a tactile learner. This is where it becomes difficult for many teachers, because the auditory learner and the visual learner, well, that's acceptable. But once a kid starts touching things and has to play with things, it becomes more difficult. So a tactile learner, think of your hands. Okay, a tactile learner needs to feel things with his fingers. When information is presented, he wants to touch the information if it's at all possible, or at the very least have something in his hand in order to keep his mind on receiving the information. So often just having a pencil in his or her hand, or if you have a scoosh ball or any other type of ball that doesn't make noise. Now, the key to having these in your classroom, or any type of ball like this, and a great cheap one is a balloon, and you put flour in it and you wrap it around with a couple more balloons, and it becomes this great squeezy toy for kids. It's cheap, generally free, and easy to make, and if it breaks, it's not a big deal, except they have flour everywhere, but I've rarely ever seen that. So you would tell the students who are tactile, after teaching them all of this about intake modes, some of you need to have this in your hands. And that allows you to listen. So, all right, and so you would say, now this ball does not leave your hand. If you need to write, you put it on your desk. And you write, and then you pick it up again. It does not go back and forth. Okay, you certainly don't throw it up in the air. Obviously, that'll be a distraction. What we're teaching you, students, is that you need, some of you, to be touching something with your hands. And so that's why this is not a toy, but it's a learning tool. Also, because it never leaves your hand, you don't give it to anybody else. If that happens, I take it you don't get it for the day or even for the week. Again, I taught that, and a few times I would have to take these away, but in general, never had a problem. What ended up happening is kids would come into the classroom saying, today, mister, I need a ball. Can you give me a ball because I'm feeling stressed or whatever? That's why they call them stress balls too. Okay, now, here's a typical setup with a kid who is a tactile learner. Okay, the kid is sitting in class and he is tapping his pencil. So, Jimmy, stop doing that. So now Jimmy's not doing it, but he has to learn, right? Because he's listening, and so he starts again. Jimmy, I said stop it. So Jimmy stops. So now he's really focused on not tapping. But you're already upset as the teacher. So you're like, oh, Jimmy, you got me mad. You were tapping. You were crinkling things. I saw. You were, All right, so then Jimmy's now not making those noises. And so you say, all right, Jimmy, what's the answer to number 3? And Jimmy says, I don't know. And you say, what do you mean you don't know? And Jimmy's thinking, yeah, I'm doing exactly what you told me to do. I'm not tapping. And see, by getting angry at these kids and thinking that they're really just playing, when really they're tactile learners, we get them in trouble and we actually impede their learning. Many of our students are tactile learners. Now, the fourth type is the kinesthetic learner. The kinesthetic learner tends to be even more difficult to have in a class than our tactile learners. Why? Because they need to move their legs. So think about that. You have these students in your classroom where they just need to be up and moving. Well, allow it. This type of student needs to have their legs moving in order to receive, remember, intake information. So a way to do this is possibly to allow the student to stand up at his or her desk. Now, almost all of us have tiles on our floors, so you could tell the student, you need to stay in those 4 tiles. I've seen teachers put tape on the floor and say, this is your area of learning. And so the student stands up and he does not leave that area. Or the student is told you have to keep one hand on your desk at all times, or chair if it's one of the attached kind. I've had students who literally will pace in the back of the room. So seating, where do you sit a student like this? Well, near the edges, in the back or to the sides. Why? So when he or she needs to stand up, he's not in the middle of the classroom where he's in the way of you, and that could be obviously distracting. But certainly if he's sitting near the wall and he needs to stand up, he just simply stands up and he starts working, or he's standing there. Sometimes they can literally just crouch over their desk like this and work that way. It's allowing them the freedom to do so. Now, I had a teacher ask me, well, what about when they're like taking notes? Well, again, if you are teaching them a skill, you teach the skill. So for example, in all of these intake modes, never is it recommended to have it willy-nilly free, go ahead, guys, whatever you want to do it as long as you take in the information. That's chaos. No. It's addressing these different intake modes at different points within a given lesson or within at least a given week. So for example, with note-taking, you're teaching note-taking. So that means, students, you need to sit down and take notes. You can't be pacing in the back of the room. However, you could stand up and take those notes. You could sit on the floor and take those notes. Again, that's up to you as a teacher if you want to allow that much freedom. But remember, there is that kind of longing. We had another teacher who said, was sharing a story of when he was in school, he often he was undiagnosed Tourette's. And so he would need to move. And at times he would be so stuck in his chair because he was not allowed to move that he would actually go home in pain because he was not allowed to move. Now, you might not have students with Tourette syndrome, but you might. You might have students who have ADHD and they need to move in order to focus. You may just have students who are kinesthetic learners or tactile learners. How are you going to address them? So now, in the live version of this, we did a music mix and match, which is something like this. You play some music, and while it's playing, the students are circulating and mingling. When the music stops, they grab a partner, and I like to make it jokingly, hey, gently, don't grab them too hard, and then they wait for instructions. In this case, you would ask a question, and then the two of them answer the question. and then you go back to the music, and so on and so on and so forth. It's a great, great technique because number one, you've got music going, so you definitely address the auditory learner in something. You definitely address the kinesthetic because you're up and moving around. You address the tactile because they're grabbing another person, and maybe you're not addressing the visual. Okay, but you got 3 out of 4 in one shot. All right, so that's great. Now let's get to the learning styles. Now this is how the information gets used once it's in the mind. So think of process. Once the intake mode has been allowed to happen naturally, and so now the information comes into the mind, how does it then get processed inside? How does actual learning occur? And there are 4 different styles of this happening. There are multiple different forms and types and different titles for all of these. This is what I use. It makes sense to me. You can use whatever style you want. Some are very, very complex when you look online and you start doing your research for learning styles. So I call them immediate action, pensive action, observant action, and personal action. So when we talk about immediate action, this immediate actor just wants to get into it. You know, it's kind of like us, stop talking, stop giving directions, and just let me start. So this is the type of student who immediately, you're not even done giving the instructions, is already up and out of his or her seat and starting to work. Okay, this student, after hearing the information, just needs to get right into it right away. For them, there is no such thing as really a mistake. That's not a bad thing. That's just part of learning. They often go too fast, however they're doing. They just need to do it. They learn really well by trial and error. Okay, so lots of hands-on activities for these people because they really, really want to get to the actual task at hand. Next, we have the pensive action, or the pensive actor. This person, after hearing information, needs time to just think. Just give me some time. Let me reflect. Let me rehearse in my mind what's going on. Let me meditate on it. Let me deal with it in my own way. And most importantly, let me deal with it quietly. So this is obviously difficult in a class. Do we give times, as teachers, times of just quiet reflection? Now, the third one is observant action. In this case, the observant actor is one who wants to see it modeled first. They want to see somebody else do it first. They often need the full instructions. They want to know the purpose of the assignment. They like to see an exemplar, a rubric, or an example of it done. They really want to know the strategy of it. What's the intended outcome? These are the students who go, okay, mister, so you want us to do this, that, and the other thing, right? Okay. And you want it to be blue or red? Okay, red, doesn't matter. Okay, just want to make sure. So they really need things articulated in order for them to get right into it. And then finally, we have the personal action, personal actor. They take this information. They're usually funny, and they talk a lot. These are the kids that often sit themselves in the front row, and they do a lot of talking. These are the people who take the information, they intook it. Is that a word? Intook? Yeah, okay, I'm going to make it up. They intook the information, and the way that they process is by talking it through. So they make personal connections. Oh, mister, that reminds me of what my brother once. Or, do you know what, miss? I went on a vacation in which, oh, my aunt once did this thing. I had a puppy once. They seem to always have a story for everything. They often think aloud. There seems to be no filter between their mind and their mouth. It just kind of pours right out. So now, in the live action version of this workshop, we did a numbered heads together. And again, this is a great activity to use. So you have the students in groups of 4. Within those groups, they number off 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, when you're going to make sure that they've numbered off, you say, okay, who are my number 1s? Raise your hand. Number 2s? Okay, my number 3s. And finally, my number 4s. All right. And that way you check, did everybody really number off? Okay, next, you pose a question to the whole class. The groups then discuss the answer, they discuss the question, and they come up with an answer, a response. What you're going to do next is you're going to randomly select a number, 1, 2, 3, or 4. You can use a die, you can use a spinner, whatever, names out of a hat, not names, but numbers out of a hat, popsicle sticks, whatever. And so let's say you roll your die and you get a 4. Okay, so all number 4s stand up. So every number 4 in the class stands up. And now you have to determine what group is going to be the one who are going to respond. So you'd have to number each of the groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 24 kids in the class. Okay? And then you roll the die again, 1 through 6, and it's number 3. So group 3, number 4, you are responding. Everybody else remains standing. I like to have them remain standing, so they're all active. And they listen to the response, and then you ask the rest of the number 4s, is that correct? Do you want to add anything? Okay, go ahead and sit down, and then you do it again. Okay, and so for practice today, you have 3 options. Option number 1, review your lessons for the week or a particular unit, and where do you address the different intake modes, and where have you addressed the different learning styles? If you realize through this reflection that, oops, I didn't address any of the intake modes except for auditory and visual. Okay, so how are you going to get it tactile? How are you going to get it kinesthetic? And the same with the learning styles. Okay, option 2 is you can label your students with an intake mode and label them with a learning style. So on pages 32 and 33, you have 2 different worksheets there. How my students intake information and my students' learning styles. So think of your class, or your classes. You might want to divide this up if you're a secondary teacher. Say my period 1, class 2, 3, and 4, or whatever. And think, all right, now Jimmy, he's definitely an auditory learner. Okay, Paul, he is a tactile learner, and go on from there. And then also do the same with the learning styles. And then finally for option 3 is determine appropriate tasks for different intake modes. And that's on page 34. It's called Accessible Education. And then the next page, too, is 35, is determine appropriate tasks for different learning styles. So in those 2, in Accessible Education, you will turn to page 39, where you have some sample lesson plans. This is in your study guide. And you cut those out and you paste them where it says, place lesson here. And then you determine, you're teaching this lesson based on the objective that I've just given you. And what would you do for a visual learner, for an auditory learner, and so on. And then in the aim for learning, you're going to choose 4 students in your classes, one of whom is an immediate actor, an observant actor, pensive actor, and a personal actor. You're going to put their names in the little boxes given, and then how are you going to address them in a given lesson or unit, or you can use one of the sample lesson plans on page 39. Now, on page 37 and 38, you have a learning styles inventory that you can give to your students and you yourself can take. It's only for learning styles, not for intake modes. I'm working on that one. But what I used to do, and this worked very well, is I would simply teach the intake modes and the learning styles as a mini lesson, 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. And from that, as I'm explaining the different intake modes, I would ask, okay, how many are my auditory learners? How many are my visual learners? How many are my, and you move on from there. And you might make mental notes. And then you do the same thing with learning styles. I once had a class that was very difficult. It was a 10th grade class, and they would often talk a lot when I would get them into their group activities, and it was they would take a day or 2 longer than the other class, just because they were such a talkative group, and I couldn't figure it out, and I tried all the things that you would try. And then I did the learning styles and intake modes teaching, and guess what I found out? That was a class of 90%, almost all of the students were observant actors. I had no immediate actors. And I had 1 or 2 personalizers, personal actors. You know how weird that is? So what was happening was when they were in their groups, nobody was taking the first step. You know how normally you have in your group, you have at least one kid who's just going to be like, yeah, let's go, let's get into it. And then you have the others who go, wait, let's try this, let's try that. This class had none. Whoa! So now when I made my activities and tasks, group works, oh man, now I had to really think about, I have to force them to do something first so that they'll do it. All right, we'll see you for lesson 4. Have a great day.